Welcome to The Real in Real Estate, your gateway to the source. I'm so glad you're here. We're all about diving into the nitty-gritty of real estate, sharing insights, tips, and some awesome interviews straight from the industry's beating heart. From the latest trends to cool investment strategies, we've got you covered. Let's explore and uncover all the essential tools and knowledge you need for navigating the ever-evolving world of property and housing. Here we go. Okay, welcome back to The Real in Real Estate. Today we're talking to insurance expert Leash Yu, and we're going to talk about flood insurance. I had Leash on the podcast earlier, and we talked about insurance in general, but today we're going to talk about flood insurance. We're getting into flood season, hurricane season here in the Houston area, and here's the expert. So we're going to get started. Welcome, Leash.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Jean. I really appreciate it.
So flood insurance, everybody, there's still a lot that people don't understand about it, but let's just start off with the basic question. Does everybody need flood insurance? Who needs flood insurance?
Everybody that lives in the greater Houston area needs flood insurance without an exception. Whether your lender requires it or not, you really need to get it. And so whether you're in the high-risk flood zone, low-risk flood zone X, X500, AEVE, please consider flood insurance.
So if I'm in a 500 or an X, why would I really need to spend the money on that? And are there different prices for different flood zones?
There are different prices for different addresses in different areas of town. But back in October of 2021, FEMA totally changed the way that they rate flood insurance. In the past, it used to be rated based on what flood zone you lived in. And then if you were in the high-risk flood zone, they would rate it based on the elevation of your home. Today, there's no regard to the rate compared to what zone you live in, but you can assume that if you're in the high-risk flood zone, you should be paying a little bit more than those that are not in the high-risk.
Well, that's definitely different.
It's very different now. The flood zones are only in place for the lenders to verify whether or not they're going to require flood insurance.
Oh, okay.
And so yeah, it's a very interesting situation now. They're not looking at the flood zones anymore.
So
But
why it doesn't seem right if I'm in a an X, which to explain to everybody what X is.
yeah, X is the low to moderate risk flood zone, and then there's an X500 that has an elevation where which is an elevation above sea level, which they anticipate there will be rainwaters or floodwaters if it rains 18 inches in a day. Right. So, but X and X500 are still what they call low to moderate risk, and the lenders don't require that you purchase flood zones if you live in one of these zones, right? They only require flood insurance if you live in zone AE or zone VE, which, I call VE the very bad flood zone or the very high risk flood zone, and AE is the high risk flood zone.
Okay, so as a consumer, which we all are, if I'm in an X, you're saying I'm going to pay almost the same as someone in an AE or a high risk flood area?
It depends. That's a great question, but it depends on what area of town you live in. So in my area of town, which is West University, I used to pay before October of 2021. My flood rate was $572 a year because I was in the low risk flood zone, and that was the cost for homes that were in the low risk for FEMA's flood insurance.
Right.
The new rate after October 2021 went to about $2,300 a year for my house, right? So again, low risk flood zone. There are high risk flood zone areas around town where you'll pay much less than $2,200 for flood insurance, which is very, very interesting. So flood insurance is not rate. It's not based on your zones anymore, but they look at things like, how close you are to a flooding area, what type of flooding risk does your area sustain, how often does your area flood, and they threw another one in here about the values of your homes. Like, so the higher the home value is, the more that they can charge you for flood insurance, which is really, really interesting.
Yes,
right?
it is.
And they still do look at the elevation of your home, but they don't require an elevation certificate anymore, even though I highly recommend the elevation certificate because that's really the only way that you can gauge the likelihood of your home flooding. So very important to get an elevation certificate if you're in the high risk flood zone these
Okay,
days.
I was going to ask you about that. It's more for to know what to expect than to have a difference in. Okay,
Yeah, and the higher you're at the elevation of your home, the lower your flood insurance should be. And
okay,
so if you're in the high risk flood zones, it's always good to get the elevation certificate, not just to understand the flood risk, but to also see if there's an additional discount with FEMA if you submit the elevation certificate to FEMA during the rating period. Right.
okay.
And so yeah, it's always good to get the elevation certificate. And I almost require it for all of our clients because it's incredibly important for the clients that are buying in the high risk flood zones.
Okay. Well, talk to us about coverage limits and deductibles, or deductibles you may not be able to talk about, but coverage limits. What does it cover? What does it limit?
Yeah. So FEMA's flood insurance policy covers out of the box, it covers $250,000 for the dwelling of your home. And it covers $100,000 maximum for your contents. And these are two maximum amounts that they'll cover. And so the deductibles can be as low as $1,000 for the dwelling and $1,000. There's two deductibles, one for the dwelling and one for the contents, but you can increase the deductibles to $10,000 if you want to try to minimize the cost.
Okay.
Right. So even if you live in a $2 million house and have FEMA's flood insurance policy, the most that they will pay for damage to the house is $250,000. Right. And
Interesting.
the most that they will pay for contents is $100,000. So, but I always recommend that if you live in a house that's worth more than $250,000 to max out the flood insurance coverage because that's appropriate for your situation.
Absolutely. And I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but your regular homeowner's insurance is not going to pick up anything outside that 250 or that 100. Am I correct?
That is correct. If your homeowners, if your home floods from a source that's inside your house, like a pipe breaks, a toilet overflows, a
Mm.
bathtub overflows, an appliance leaks, your homeowner's insurance should pick that up, right? And they'll pick
Right.
up the you can't live in the house while it's being repaired, so they'll send you to a hotel and pay for the hotel while it's being repaired. FEMA's flood policy only covers the rising water that comes into the home. And if water rises from outside into the house, your homeowner's insurance will not cover that. You have to look at FEMA's policy to cover that. And they will only cover the water damage that the home sustains and the water damage that your contents sustain. They won't pay for you to live in a hotel.
Mm.
You can't live there because your home flooded, right? And you can't invoke that coverage on your homeowner's insurance policy because flooding is exterior to interior flooding is excluded,
Okay, I was
right?
going to ask you to define that, and you just did, so thank you
Yeah,
very much.
you
Now, is
bet.
this this insurance is purchased through the government, or is this private, or is there options for
Yeah,
flood
so,
insurance?
so the FEMA flood insurance policy is underwritten by the federal government,
Okay,
underwritten by the Federal Emergency Management Association. So you purchase this policy through different insurance companies that have allowed or have approval to sell FEMA's flood insurance policies. So Wright Insurance Company is probably the biggest flood insurance writer out there. And they're called Wright, WRIGT. That's an insurance company, but companies like Nationwide Insurance, Progressive, Travelers, they all write FEMA's
flood
flood insurance
insurance.
policy, but it is a FEMA policy. Now, you can also buy private coverage, like private insurance coverage that is not FEMA backed. And sometimes those private carriers can offer a less expensive option for you. And most of the time, if you live in the low risk flood zones, a private insurance carrier, such as Neptune probably, or Aon's product, can be less expensive than FEMA's policy. But
That's
what we're
interesting.
seeing, yeah, what we're seeing most of the time, though, the folks that are required to get it, the high risk flood zone areas, the Neptunes and the private carriers are typically more expensive. And so
Mm.
it's better to stay on typically speaking, the FEMA policy than it is the private coverage that's
Okay.
available that's there.
Okay, well, you would be the one to help them evaluate that,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah,
great.
we can definitely contact your insurance agent on that because
Yeah.
we always quote both ways, the private option and the FEMA option. And so we see a lot of situations where it just doesn't make sense for high risk folks to purchase a private policy.
Sure. So, let's assume the worst has happened. A homeowner has water, foot in their house. What do they do? How do the claim process work? Should they start cleaning out the home? What do you suggest?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the when your house is starting to sustain water, but due to whatever reason it is, but especially if it's rising from the outside in, when the water start receding, you need to start drying everything out as much as possible. And also the contents coverage for your house is it's not replacement cost, it's actual cash value. So it's basically garage sale value. So
Mm,
we've seen situations where people think, oh, I've got flood insurance, so I'm just going to let my sofa and all my contents just sit in the
mm.
water. But then they get 10 cents on the dollar for the Jimmy Choo shoes, right? So
Oh,
you
wow.
try to minimize the damage that happens, so just assume that you don't have coverage because garage sale value is terrible to have. And so you want to try to get everything off the ground as possible if you are home. Now, when waters start receding, start drying things out for sure. Give your insurance agent a call so they can file a claim for you. So, an adjuster should contact you, and within a couple of days. Now, these
Okay.
big that come in when everybody's underwater, it does take a little bit more time, but you do want to try to get on the list as fast as possible, right? So
Right.
so number one, start drying everything out. Number two, pick up the phone, call your insurance agent, and say, hey, my house flooded, and we need to start a FEMA flood claim.
Well, that's interesting to know. I didn't realize that it was quote unquote garage sale reimbursement. That's interesting. Now that would be for a sofa. What about like kitchen cabinets and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so for a primary resident, the only thing that FEMA will replace, like pay replacement cost on, is the building or the dwelling of your primary residence. So if you have
Okay.
renters, if you have a rental home or a business or a secondary home, they're paying actual cash value on everything, the home and the contents. For your primary residence, if it's attached to the home, like your kitchen cabinets, your lighting fixtures, your flooring,
Mhm.
your hardwired appliances, FEMA's policy will pay to replace the dwelling items that are damaged in
Okay.
your primary residence.
Okay.
Okay. So,
Okay.
but yeah, contents are always actual cash value only. So basically garage sale value.
Okay. So even though if you have a $500,000 house, the 250 and the 100 may not cover your expenses, but it goes a long way.
Goes a long way.
Yeah.
Yes. And again, primary residence, that 250, if it's a big loss, they're just going to write you a check for
Yeah.
$250,000.
Yeah.
Most of the claims that we've sustained, with the exception of Harvey and when the reservoir was released and all those
Yeah.
homes were underwater for 30 days, most of the historical claims that have happened in the kind of the greater Houston area, interloop Houston, have been floodwaters come in and then a couple inches go into the house and recede and come out, a couple hours later.
Right.
And those flood claims are, $100,000 flood claims or so. Very rarely do they get to 250 when on a typical flood situation. But Harvey proved totally different.
Yeah.
Uh, but every storm's different. And I just would not assume, hey, my house didn't flood in Harvey, so I don't need flood insurance. The next Harvey that comes along could be a totally different animal with a different personality to flood different houses than Harvey did. So
Yeah.
it's so important to make sure that you do have flood insurance to cover that.
Okay. Well, absolutely. Um, Now, I Googled some myths about flood insurance, so I thought we'd address those. I think you've addressed the first one. Only residents of high-risk flood zones need to insure their property. The answer to that is no.
No. And so I was in a seminar yesterday with Jeff Lindner, with the Harris County Flood Control District, and he reminded us of how awful Harvey was.
Mhm.
But he also emphasized how important it is for everybody to have flood insurance, because 68% of the buildings that flooded during Hurricane Harvey were not in the high risk flood zone.
Mm.
Almost 70% of the structures flooded were not in the high risk flood zone, and
Oh my
most of
God.
vast majority did not have flood insurance because weren't required to purchase it.
Right.
You know, so yes, just because your lender doesn't require it doesn't mean you don't need it. You need it.
Right. Now, a question, and of course, you cannot speak for all insurance people, but as a realtor, talk to your insurance agent, make sure you can get insurance on your home as soon as we get the process started, like we discussed the last time. Are all insurance agents supposed to be suggesting flood insurance to people?
Yeah, I mean, if they're doing their job correctly, they're definitely supposed to be not just suggesting, but they should be providing a
Or
quote or
just automatic?
whatever. Yeah, it should be an automatic thing. But I can tell you that, this is my 22nd year in the business. I can tell you most insurance agents do not quote it unless somebody asks them to quote it or they're in the high risk flood zone. So as your clients are coming to you, I mean, you do suggest it, but I would always have your clients ask for a flood insurance quote as well, because it's not an automatic thing unless they're in the high risk flood zone.
Okay, everybody out there listening, be sure to ask your insurance agent. Even if you're not just now buying a house, ask them now anyway. Okay,
Yes.
another myth I found was you can't buy flood insurance if you're located in a high risk zone. True or false?
Totally. You can buy flood insurance in almost any situation. There are
Okay.
some weird situations where you cannot, and that is when the community doesn't participate in the National Flood Insurance Program,
Oh,
or they have these things called Cobra zones or coastal barrier reef areas where you can't buy flood insurance. They basically don't want you to develop in those areas, so they won't
oh,
provide in those areas. But the vast majority there, especially the greater Houston area, there's very, very few situations where you cannot purchase flood insurance. Even if your home has flooded a million times, you still should be able to get a FEMA flood insurance policy for your home, right? And
great.
that's kind of the problem with FEMA, is they just continue to pay flood claims even on homes that have flooded multiple times, right?
Wow. Wow. At that point, call your realtor and get a new home.
Yes.
Okay. Another myth, federal disaster assistance will pay for the flood damage.
That's kind of a true myth, but they will pay for some damage. It's usually like $5,000 for the damage,
Mm.
and the flood has to be considered an emergency, a federal emergency, right? So there's lots of floods that aren't federal emergencies. Typically speaking, when a hurricane comes through, or a tropical storm comes through, or a big rain event comes through, it can be considered a federal emergency. But if it's just a kind of a random rain that floods your house, a water main that breaks and floods your house, it's some weird situation that just floods your house, the federal government is not going to consider that a federal emergency, so there's
Okay.
no funds available to you. But even when they do consider it a federal emergency, the funds are incredibly limited, like maybe $5,000 for
Okay.
you. Yeah, so
Okay.
don't
Don't
count on,
rely on that.
yeah, do not rely on that.
Okay, let's talk timing. Another myth, you cannot buy flood insurance immediately before or during a flood.
So that's true and false. You can buy
Okay.
flood insurance at any point in time. If a hurricane is sitting there on the Gulf of Mexico about to cross into Texas, you can still call your insurance agent and buy flood insurance. However, there's a 30-day wait on any flood policy that is not bought before the day you close on a new house with a loan, right? So if you buy a house with cash, there's a 30-day wait for flood insurance. If you buy a house with a loan, you can buy the effective date immediately the day of closing, as long as you purchase it at least a day before closing, right?
Okay.
So any other time besides buying a house with a loan, there is a 30-day wait. So you can buy it at any time, but just consider that you're going to wait 30 days before coverage is effective.
Okay. Another myth I found was you cannot buy flood insurance if your property has been flooded before, and I think you just dispelled that myth
Yeah,
earlier.
that is definitely a myth. You can still
Mhm.
buy flood insurance.
Yes, and this I found interesting. The last one was wind-driven rain is considered flooding. It's not, is it? It's
It
got
is
to be
not.
rising water from the outside.
Got to be rising water from the outside. So there was a big lawsuit down in Mississippi years ago, where the homeowners insurance policies were declining the flood, and the FEMA they were declining flooding of the home, but the class action lawsuits say, well, it flooded because wind pushed the water into the house.
Mhm.
Right. And so all of those homeowners that didn't have flood insurance, and there was a senator named Trent Lott that kind of spearheaded that this class action lawsuit. He didn't have flood insurance. The homes flooded, and they argued it was wind that was pushing the water into the house. But it's rising water that comes in. If rising water comes in, FEMA's flood policy should pay regardless if wind pushes it or not. Homeowners insurance does not pay for rising water that comes in.
Mhm.
So, so yeah, wind-driven rain is otherwise known as rain that's coming through your windows, seals, in the thresholds of your doors, because the wind's being driven so hard. 100-mile-an-hour tornado or hurricane winds can cause wind to come through even the siding of your home. And if that happens, your homeowner's insurance should cover it, not FEMA's flood insurance policy.
Okay. All right, great. One thing that just came to mind when you were talking about, you can buy flood insurance if there's a hurricane in the Gulf, but if you're buying a home, the they won't write homeowners insurance until the hurricane's out of the Gulf. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
For homeowners insurance, if a hurricane is tracking towards your specific state, so say the hurricane is in the Gulf of Mexico and has crossed the coordinates of roughly where the tip of Florida is and where Cuba is, if it's tracking towards your area, your county, or if it just starts and appears in the Gulf of Mexico, the insurance carriers can decide, hey, we're not going to write flood insurance I'm sorry, we're not going to write homeowners insurance anymore, and we're not going to allow you to even buy auto insurance. They can totally shut down.
Shut down.
And so if you're buying a house this summer, make sure you just go ahead and bind the homeowners insurance so you're not impacted by that.
Mm.
Right. So go ahead and purchase not just flood insurance, but homeowners insurance, so you can avoid any random storm that pops up that could disallow you from binding coverage and missing your closing date. So
Great.
yeah, that's a great question.
Look into that as soon as you go under contract, people.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything we haven't talked about related to flood insurance you want to bring up? I know we covered a lot of topics.
Yeah, so for your clients that are buying houses and your clients that are selling homes that have a FEMA flood insurance policy, FEMA allows you to assume a current flood insurance policy that is in force, right? So say I'm selling my house to you, Gene, and
Okay.
you go get a flood quote for my house, and it's $2,200. But I right now I'm only paying $800, right? You can say, hey, I want the $800 policy versus the $2,200 policy. So Leash, will you transfer your policy to me? And I can say, yes, you can have my policy. Right
Ah,
now, you can assume my $800 policy. Every year, FEMA will increase that $800 policy by 18% until it reaches the $2,200 mark. So it'll take roughly 5 or 6 years for you to get from $800 to $2,200, but you
mhm.
save a lot of money throughout those years, right?
Absolutely.
You don't. So if you buy a house that doesn't have flood, if I didn't have flood insurance on my home and you were to buy flood insurance on my home right now, you would immediately pay the $2,200.
Right.
So the bottom line is FEMA allows the assumption of a flood policy. And number two, it will continue to increase 18% every year until you get to the true
Mhm.
actual rate. So
Well,
just
that's
don't.
fascinating. I had no idea that you could assume that.
Yeah, they allow this, but not every insurance carrier will allow it.
Okay.
For example, USAA will not transfer a flood policy from a member USAA member to another USAA member. They just don't do that
Ah,
at USAA.
interesting.
Yeah, so some insurance agents don't know how to do it, so they'll just refuse to transfer the policy also. But FEMA does allow it. There's just no obligation for me to transfer it as a seller. There's no obligation for the insurance agent to handle the paperwork, but it is allowable, right?
Interesting. Okay. So
It'd be a
everybody,
very
okay,
good tool, a money saving tool for flood insurance if you assume somebody else's policy.
absolutely. And if your agent doesn't know about it, contact Leash. He can straighten that
Contact
out
me.
for you.
Yeah, we can definitely help you.
Okay, anything else interesting? That I had no idea about that. That's very interesting.
No, so the only other thing that I want to emphasize is that risk rating 2.0 that came out October of 2021 totally changed the rates in the Houston area, right? They increased the rates in the Houston area. So we are seeing a lot of people that aren't purchasing flood insurance right now because they think it's too expensive.
Right.
So I want to urge you guys, I know it, and let you know, I know it's expensive, but you do not forget about flood insurance because it's so important, right? And so people tend to forget how bad it is when their house is flooded, when the areas flood. And it's been 7 years since Harvey, but these storms that are hitting the northeast side of town right now, in the East Fork of the San Jacinto, those are record level floods also.
Wow.
So it's just a crazy situation right now. So don't forget, please purchase flood insurance. It's very, very important.
Okay. All right. I think everybody heard that. Hopefully
Yes.
they will do so. Well, Leash, thank you so much for coming back on to our podcast and talking about flood insurance and dispelling the myths and explaining things that I didn't even realize. The assumption is of the flood insurance, possible assumption of the flood insurance policy is a very, very good thing if you can
Yes,
make that
absolutely.
work. All right.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you so much for having us on. If you have any questions, just give me a call.
Yes, and I will have his contact information in the podcast info below. And unless you want to give something out right now.
The easiest way to get in touch with me is my email, which is Leash, spelled like a dog leash, LEASH @agencyyu.com.
Thank you, Leash. Insurance
You bet.
agent extraordinaire.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
so
much.
much.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to The Real in Real Estate, your gateway to the source. Be sure not to miss our upcoming episodes loaded with fantastic insights, expert tips, and all the latest trends in the property scene. Don't forget to stay connected with us on our Trilogy Realty Group socials: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and even TikTok. Until next time, take care.